Imagine your first night as a married couple, meant to be a private and intimate moment, suddenly witnessed by strangers. Or worse, at the tender age of 12, your parents marry you off to secure more land and power. In today's world, such scenarios seem unthinkable, but in medieval Europe they were not only common, they were expected. Love had no place in these marriages. Consent? It was rarely even considered. What happened behind closed doors was often darker than anyone could have imagined. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about romance or personal choice. Families arranged marriages to secure alliances, protect property, and climb the social ladder. Young people involved in these unions had no say, their voices didn't matter. This was a decision made by parents or lords, often before the children could even speak. Betrothals, or formal promises to marry, were arranged when children were as young as 7. It wasn't about love, it was a business transaction sealed with a payment. Typically, the groom's family offered a dowry not as a romantic gesture, but as a way to ensure security. Once the deal was made, it was almost impossible to back out without scandal. The church required both parties to give verbal consent for the marriage to be valid, but in practice, it meant little. Girls as young as 12 were brought to the altar, while boys as young as 14 were expected to take on the responsibilities of marriage. If a girl hesitated, her family would convince her if she resisted there was the threat of punishment. A reluctant yes was all it took for the marriage to be legitimate. Marriage was about power and land for the nobility, and about survival and labor for the common folk. A girl's worth wasn't measured by love, but by the political advantages her marriage could provide. A daughter's value could be seen in how well her marriage could strengthen alliances. If a father had to pledge her to a man twice her age to secure wealth or protection, he did it without hesitation. Her feelings were irrelevant. Even royalty was not exempt from these cold arrangements. Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine, not for love, but to gain control over her lands. Similarly, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united to form the Kingdom of Spain. Personal feelings were irrelevant. These unions were power moves. It was a time when a single marriage could change the course of history and redraw the borders of entire nations. Among peasants, marriages were simpler but still arranged by families. A girl might be promised to a neighbor to combine fields or share livestock. Her feelings about this arrangement were not even considered. The concept of marrying for love was unheard of. Girls were trained from a young age to become wives, learning to spin, cook, serve, and obey. Boys, on the other hand, were taught to provide, rule the household, and claim their bride when the time was right. When the age was right, usually around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, the marriage was formalized. Sometimes the couple didn't meet until their wedding day. Betrothals were legally binding, and breaking them could lead to financial ruin, disgrace, or legal punishment. Families chose partners carefully, but once a decision was made, obedience was expected. The wedding day arrived and all focus shifted to appearances. Clothes were made, food was prepared, and guests were invited. But the union itself left little room for emotion. It was a public event meant to signal the world that a new alliance had been forged. The bride often understood what was expected of her. She was leaving her family, moving into a new home, and becoming part of another man's property. The ceremony itself was a public spectacle. In medieval Europe, weddings were often held outside church doors with the entire village in attendance. A priest or bishop would stand between the couple speaking sacred words while the community watched. This wasn't a private moment between two people, it was a public announcement, a statement of ownership. The bride stood on the groom's left, and after vows were exchanged, the rings were placed on their fingers. The ring wasn't just a symbol of love, it was a mark of ownership, signaling to the world that the woman had been claimed. The wedding ceremony, though grand and celebrated, was more about power than passion. After the vows, There was often a feast, music, and dancing, showcasing the wealth and status of the family. But even amidst the celebration, the bride was always reminded of her new position. Her father would take her hand and place it in the groom's, symbolizing the transfer of her authority from one man to another. This wasn't just a tradition, it was a legal and societal transition. The bride had no legal personhood. Her father controlled her before the marriage. After the vows, her husband controlled her. The veil, another common custom, served a different purpose in the Middle Ages. While it is often seen as a symbol of modesty today, back then it was a shield for the groom. The bride's appearance was kept hidden until after the vows were exchanged. Only then could the groom lift the veil to reveal his bride's face. If he wasn't pleased, it was too late. The deal had already been sealed. The veil was not there to protect the bride. It was there to protect the marriage contract. And then there was the best man whose job was not just ceremonial. In some cases, he was armed, standing by to protect the bride from any disruption. If someone tried to interrupt the ceremony, or even if the bride tried to escape, he was there to ensure that the marriage was completed. Marriage was not always peaceful. It was sometimes contested, and the best man's role was to guarantee that order prevailed. Once the wedding ceremony ended, the real test of the marriage began. The bride and groom's first night together was the most important. In medieval society, a woman's virginity was seen as proof of her purity, obedience, and family honor. A woman's body carried the reputation of her father, brothers, and future husband. The church taught that intimacy before marriage was a grave sin. A woman's choices were limited: either remain celibate and join a convent, or marry and bear children. The pressure to prove virginity on the wedding night was immense. Families, especially among the nobility, demanded proof that the bride had never been with another man. After the wedding, the bed linens were often checked for blood. If blood was found, it was taken as proof that the bride had been untouched and that the child she would bear could only belong to her husband. In extreme cases, the blood-stained sheets were shown to family members or even held up for the entire wedding party to witness. This was done to protect the husband's name and ensure that any future children were legitimate heirs. Failure to provide this proof could result in a devastating scandal. The marriage could be annulled, alliances could be lost, and the woman's reputation could be destroyed. In some cases, she could be sent away or even locked in a convent. For royalty, the consequences could be catastrophic. A queen's honor could be questioned, and her children declared illegitimate, potentially unraveling entire dynasties. In peasant communities, the consequences were less formal but equally harsh. Women who failed to prove her virginity could be mocked, shamed, and ostracized. Perhaps the most disturbing custom, though, was just primae noctis, or the lord's right of the first night. This was the belief that a feudal lord had the right to sleep with a peasant bride before her husband on their wedding night. While some historians argue this practice was more symbolic or enforced through taxes, others suggest it did happen in rare cases. Either way, it was a display of power and dominance. The Lord's control over the woman's body was a clear signal of his authority. But the night didn't end there. In many European cultures, after the wedding, the newlyweds were led to their bed by family and friends. In some cases, the couple was undressed in front of witnesses. The guests would then leave the room or pretend to leave, waiting for a signal that the marriage had been consummated. In Iceland, at least 6 men had to witness the bedding to make the marriage valid. In some German towns, the entire community would gather outside the room while drums and pipes drowned out the sounds inside. This public ceremony emphasized that the marriage was not a private affair, it was a community event, and it was everyone's business. The church also imposed strict rules on when married couples could be intimate. No physical relations were allowed on Sundays, Thursdays, Fridays, or during Lent and other holy seasons. Even after marriage, intimacy was allowed only for the purpose of having children. Pleasure, passion, and desire were seen as sinful. A wife was expected to fulfill her marital duties without question. Refusing her husband's requests for intimacy could be considered a sin, while a husband could refuse his wife without facing any consequences.